Good morning and welcome to this webinar. Hi, my name is Kevin Wong and I'm the Director of the Desert Institute at Joshua Tree National Park, which is the educational program of the Joshua Tree National Park Association. With me is Lara Roselle of the National Park Service, who originally proposed a series of webinars to train park staff on park-specific topics while they are working remotely during this pandemic. We will be your hosts of this webinar. Before we get started, I would like to offer some tips on how to use this webinar effectively. As internet bandwidth is heavily used in California during the stay-at-home direction, and so many of us are working remotely, we may have issues with internet connections. If you have audio or monitor issues during this webinar, it may be due to having too many programs open, including email or Facebook, which have regular updates. These will reduce your access to bandwidth. In addition, when the webinar begins, you will see a small control panel on your screen, generally in the upper right corner. There is a question mark and a dialog balloon. If you click on the question mark, you can ask questions that we will present to the speaker during this presentation. We can also unmute the audience at the end of the presentation so you can ask questions directly. Please try not to ask all of your questions at the same time. Unmute or type in your questions instructions are only for those who are listening live, or conversely, disregard the instructions if you're watching on YouTube. At this time, we will begin. Today's presentation is Invasive Plants in Joshua Tree National Park with Neil Frakes. Neil, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. I'm really happy to be able to talk to you about a topic that I'm very passionate about, invasive plants here at Joshua Tree National Park. And this is a major focus of work for myself and my team here at the park. So I'm going to talk to you guys a bit about what invasive plants are, why they're a problem. I'll talk about some of the more common invasive plants at Joshua Tree and how to identify them. And lastly, I'll talk about what you can do to help prevent the spread of invasive plants here at Joshua Tree. So let me open up my presentation here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off my webcam now so you guys can focus on my slides. Okay. Let's see if my slide will advance here. It's not advancing. There we go. Okay, so first of all, just a little bit of a background on invasive plants. You've probably heard other terms like exotic plants or alien plants or non-native plants. And so, what do those different things mean? Well, the Park Service actually has its own definition of an invasive species, an invasive plant just being a plant that is an invasive species. So the Park Service definition is an invasive species is a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. So the first part of it to be invasive, it has to be non-native to the ecosystem in which it's found. And what that means is that it has to have been introduced there by humans, whether that be intentionally introduced or accidentally introduced. And then the second part of it is that it needs to cause some type of harm. So within the park, we're primarily looking at invasive plants that are causing harm to park resources. What an invasive plant is not is it is not a non-native plant that is historical. So we have some plants in the park that were intentionally planted, such as the giant reed at Keys Ranch and some eucalyptus trees at Winona Mill. Now these plants are non-native, but we are preserving them for their historic value, and so they are not invasive. So what's so bad about invasive plants? Well, invasive plants can threaten our biodiversity by displacing native plants. And invasive plants do threaten some of our rare plants that we have. Invasive plants can change ecosystem processes, and one of the big ones is fire. Invasive grasses can contribute to changing fire regimes and increasing fire on the landscape. Specifically at Joshua Tree, invasive plants threaten the existence of key resources such as Joshua trees and they can degrade the quality of forage and habitat for desert tortoise, which is an endangered species that depends on native plant species for its food and for its habitat. Combined with climate change, invasive plants threaten the vegetation at Joshua Tree on a park-wide scale. So you may, people often will let me know if maybe a Joshua tree has been hit by a car, or someone parked up on the curb, and these are problems, but compared to invasive plants and climate change, which are really impacting the park across the entire landscape, they're very minor. One thing that just a distinction that I want to make, because it's really important for understanding how invasive plants are managed, is the difference between an annual plant and a perennial plant. So annual plants are short-lived. They just live for one growing season. Approximately half the plant species at Joshua Tree are annuals. Perennial plants, on the other hand, can live for multiple years, and they reproduce multiple times. So some perennial plants are very long-lived, like Joshua trees or junipers or pinyon pines that can live hundreds of years. And some perennial plants only live for a few years, but they live for more than 1 year. Biennials are plants that live for just 2 growing seasons. So this is an important distinction because we manage annual invasive plants and perennial invasive plants quite differently. So now I'm just going to go through a series of chapters, and I'm going to describe to you some of the different invasive plants or types of invasive plants that we have in the park, and how we're managing them. So the first one is crimson fountain grass, or Pennisetum setaceum. It is a perennial grass, so it lives for multiple years. Fountain grass was introduced intentionally by humans. It's used in landscaping commonly, still is used in landscaping. So people will plant it in their yard because it is a very beautiful grass. However, it's also highly invasive. The way to distinguish fountain grass is by the flower clusters. They're very feathery looking, as you can see in the photos here. And they'll range in color from being white to being kind of purplish or crimson. I do see the crimson color very commonly. When you look closely at those feathery flower clusters, you can see these bristles that kind of come out perpendicular to the stem on which they're growing. So without those flowers, it's really hard to identify fountain grass, and it can be confused with native perennial grasses that we have in the park. Within Joshua Tree, fountain grass tends to be found in canyons, in riparian areas, along canyon floors, and also grows up onto rocky canyon walls. You don't see it very often, almost not at all, just growing in an open valley. Fountain grass also, I believe it to be cold intolerant, and you don't find fountain grass at the highest elevations in the park, generally under 4,000 feet in elevation. So one thing you'll notice is if you're in the towns of 29 Palms or Joshua Tree, you will see fountain grass growing all over the place, but you don't see it very much in Yucca Valley, other than where it's been planted, and I think that's because of its cold intolerance and the threshold that's crossed as you go up in elevation. So, one native perennial grass that we have in the park is desert needlegrass. In fact, we have a few species of needlegrass in the genus Stipa. And they can easily be confused with fountain grass. It's pretty hard to tell the difference, but if you look at the flower clusters in the photo on the left, they're not as feathery, and they don't have bristles that come out on that perpendicular angle. They can be kind of purplish in color sometimes, though, so they're easy to confuse. But generally, Stipa, the desert needlegrass, is found at higher elevations. And it often grows in more open landscapes like valleys or on slopes where you wouldn't find fountain grass, which is primarily restricted within the park to really rocky areas. This map here shows the distribution of fountain grass in California. Those little blue markers are locations of where fountain grass has been observed. It's very common in Southern California, especially in coastal Southern California, but it has made its way into the desert in the park and also along the Colorado River corridor. If we zoom into the park, this is a map of the park here. All of the red dots are observations of where we found fountain grass growing. And there's a couple interesting things to note here. One is that fountain grass can be found in some pretty remote locations, such as in the central part of the Hexie Mountains, in the Eagle Mountains, and its seeds are dispersed in the wind. So they can blow long distances, and it can establish far away from where it's been introduced. However, you'll also notice that there's a large cluster of observations just to the south west of 29 Palms, and this is the 49 Palms Canyon area and the Queen Mountain region. Fountain grass is really spread heavily into this area because of the fountain grass infestations in the city of 29 Palms. So we've been treating fountain grass for well over a decade now. We partner with the Lake Mead Invasive Plant Management Team, and they spray fountain grass with herbicide, glyphosate, and they use a blue dye, so you can see that the plants that they've treated are kind of bluish in color. And this is really, really tough work. They're working on really steep slopes. They're having to pack in a lot of water, a lot of weight in order to mix the herbicide. But where they've treated fountain grass, we've had good success in removing it. For instance, in lower 49 Palms Canyon, there are very few fountain grass plants when there used to be very many more. So we really have to stay on top of it. But fortunately, with our partnership with Lake Mead IPMT, we've been able to do some really good work on fountain grass. Now, I mentioned fountain grass is growing in the towns adjacent to the park. I had an intern a few years ago. Her name was Rose Alvarez. Maybe some of you remember her. She came to me. We were coming up with a project for her to work on. I asked what her interests were, and she told me that she was interested in urban ecology, which my first thought was, well, that's kind of an odd pick for working at Joshua Tree. But she ended up doing some systematic sampling of the city of 29 Palms to look at where fountain grass was growing in the city. And what she found was very interesting. I mentioned that fountain grass is planted intentionally. It's an ornamental grass, but only about 25% of the fountain grass plants in the city were actually cultivated by people and planted intentionally. Most of them have escaped from where it's been cultivated and growing out of cracks in the sidewalk or right at the edge of a building or in an abandoned lot, things like that. So that's hopeful, is that if we partner with the city, most of the plants aren't even desirable. So there's hope that we can get rid of it in the city, and that's a key thing that we need to do, because if we don't, we're going to continue to get introductions of fountain grass into the park. Okay, I'm going to move on to another grass, interesting infestation that we had in the park. So chapter 2 is birdseed on the boundary. So back in the late summer, early fall of 2015, right after I started working here, some of the residents that live in the Monument Manor neighborhood near the west entrance started reporting that they were seeing this plant coming up in their yard that looked kind of like corn, and they wondered what it was, and they brought in some specimens, and we identified it to be sorghum. And we went out and started taking a look, and pretty soon after that, we started seeing sorghum and another grass called millet coming up near the west entrance. And what we did is we laid out this grid, and we walked across these grid cells, and we hand pulled these grasses and recorded how many were out there. And you can see that on these maps here. So we removed over 50,000 plants of millet, over 5,000 plants of sorghum, and we also found some sunflowers growing out there. And so what we determined was that this infestation was caused as a result of birdseed use in the neighborhood adjacent to the park boundary. In fact, there was very high levels of birdseed being dispersed in that neighborhood. In fact, it was being spread on the ground, not just in feeders. So, fortunately, we were able to remove this infestation, and occasionally still we find, an occasional millet or sorghum plant coming up by the west entrance, or maybe there's a sunflower that pops up right by the entrance station. But this happened as a result of heavy use of the seed of birdseed, and also a really wet. We had a big monsoon that summer, and there was lots of moisture for these plants to grow. But after that, I had an employee Laura Ashfield, who did a study to see if you can sterilize birdseed. And the answer is that you can. So most birdseed that you buy at the store is not sterilized, and it readily germinates. If you look at the table here on the slide, at the control, 92% of our millet seeds germinated. But it's really easy to sterilize. If you can just put it in the oven and bake it for 15 minutes at a low temperature, like 300 degrees, and it'll be totally sterile. So if you like to provide food for the birds, that's great. You can do that. But if you want to make sure that you don't spread millet and sorghum seed around, you can sterilize it this way. You could just spread it out on a baking pan and cook it for a short period of time. We also tried microwaving it, but what happened was we got popcorn. So that's not the best technique to use. Okay, before I go on, I'm just going to pause and if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask at this time.
I don't see any questions. I myself, when you talk about the grass that can be mistaken for fountain grass, have you found that folks in the park have actually gone after the native and then discovered our mistake?
Yes, I don't think we've accidentally sprayed or done any treatments of thinking something was fountain grass and it wasn't, but we do get people that misidentify the needle grasses for fountain grass.
Terrific.
Okay, well, I'll keep going if there aren't any other questions.
We do have a couple of questions that just popped in. So you talked about using herbicides to get rid of the fountain grass. Are the herbicides not poisonous to animals?
Yeah, that's generally correct. What we're using, and I don't like to use herbicides just wildly without considering the other potential impacts of it. But these herbicides are created to kill plants, not animals. So they're quite safe. Now glyphosate is an herbicide that is commonly used. It's also called Roundup, is one of the names, and it's been in the news a lot lately, especially in the state of California, that it could be a potential carcinogen. And so we take that very carefully. Our staff and the IPMT that use herbicide, they have a license. They are from the state to spray, and they follow all the appropriate safety measures to ensure their safety.
Okay, and next question from somebody who clearly was not here during the saga of 2015, which I do recall. And she says, well, did you contact whoever was putting out all that birdseed?
Yes, there were attempts to contact the person, and I'm not exactly sure where it ended up, but yes, there were. We did reach out to the residents of that neighborhood to let them know about the problem and what was going on.
And question, does baking birdseed reduce the nutrients available in the seeds?
I'm not sure. I would suggest that probably at that light of a temperature and for that short of a time, it's still probably pretty nutritious, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, we have a heads up that there is currently fountain grass along Boy Scout Trail on Indian Cove. Okay, good to know. Thank you for sharing that with me.
And I'll talk a little bit about how you can record that using iNaturalist and give us some really good information so that we can go out and find it and take care of it.
And last question, is there danger of a tortoise accidentally ingesting a plant that's covered in herbicide?
I think that chance is very unlikely. But I guess it could be possible, and that's why we go through the compliance process, and we look at potential impacts of any action that we take. And so I'm collaborating with Michael Vamstead and analyzing those impacts to make sure that they're minimized as much as possible.
Yeah, and I'll say I work with Fish and Wildlife on tortoise impacts, and I have not heard of them considering that a hazard, but I can also check back with them. Looks like that's it for our questions for now.
Okay, well, thank you. I've got plenty more to share. So let's keep going. So chapter 3, invasive annual grasses, fire, and Joshua trees. This photo here is in Queen Valley of an invasive grass called schismus or Mediterranean grass, very abundant grass. Let's look a little bit more at schismus. There's a couple species of schismus. They're really hard to distinguish. The taxonomy is a little problematic too, so we just lump them together and just call them schismus. It's kind of hard to describe what schismus looks like in words. There's a couple pictures here. The picture on the upper left is from my backyard. You probably have schismus in your yard or very nearby, and if you just went outside right now, you'd probably be able to find it green and flowering. It's a very short, it's generally a short grass. It's kind of tufted, and it's everywhere. I would argue that it is probably the most common plant at Joshua Tree, unfortunately. I think we have schismus growing over, probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the park. A couple other invasive annual grasses, and again, these are grass species that just live for one growing season. They tend to do their growth in the spring, late winter into spring. They've kind of been extended this year because of the late rains that we've had. And these two are bromes. They're in the genus Bromus. These are the two most common bromes that we have in the park. On the left, we have red brome, and its flowers and seeds are upright. The other common one that we have is cheatgrass, and its flowers and seeds are nodding. So that's how you distinguish the two of them. Red brome is upright, cheatgrass is nodding. So this slide might be a little bit out of order here, but I think so. These grasses are changing our fire regime, and these grasses grow more in wet years. And so Stacy Manson put together this graph maybe a couple of months ago and shared it with park staff, looking at precipitation from Black Rock. And if you look at the years that we've had large fires in the park, there is a connection between when we get abundant rainfall and when we get fire. And we tend to get large fires in a year of abundant rainfall, or in a year or two after a year of abundant rainfall. And you can see that here. Most notably is 2006, which itself was a very dry year. But we had 4 large fires in 2006. And 2005 was an incredibly wet year. We had over 21 inches of rain at Black Rock that year. And so these grasses grew very abundantly in 2005, and then by 2006 they were dried out, they were very flammable, and that's why we got all those fires. You can see a similar pattern in 2010, another very wet year, the Keys fire. And so if you look all the way to the right end of that graph here, 2019, we had 16 inches of rain in 2019. And this year's been kind of strange, 2020, with the dry spell in January and February, but then this kind of wet boost at the end of the season. And so these grasses are growing pretty well. There's also a lot of dead fuel from 2019. And so this could be a big this could be a big potential fire year for the park. This is also documented in the scientific literature. This NDVI is a measure of greenness that's taken from a satellite, and lag NDVI is the year after a big green year. The other thing is that we have nitrogen deposition going in the park from air pollution, and that acts as a fertilizer. So when you have lots of precip and then fertilizer, you get lots of plant growth. The plants are dead and dry during the summer, during fire season. And if we get dry lightning storms, that's when we're going to have fires in the park. And so that's kind of the wild card, right? Like, we don't know if we're going to get a dry monsoon. It's a hard thing to predict. So these grasses changing our fire regime. And so we're getting fires. Most scientists think that in the Mojave, fire historically was very infrequent. And now we're getting fires that are larger in size. They burn at a higher severity, meaning they have higher levels of vegetation mortality. They tend to be more contiguous, meaning that they don't leave unburned strips or unburned islands in their wake. They're larger in size, and they're happening more often. And so we can get what's called the grass fire cycle, where you have an area that's burned is more likely to burn again because these invasive annual grasses do very well following fire. They come right back. The native species don't come back as well, with a few exceptions. And we have areas in the park that have burned 3 times since the 1970s. So this is pretty problematic. And this is very problematic to Joshua trees. So you're probably all very familiar with the threats that Joshua trees are facing because of climate change. Wildfire is another major threat to Joshua trees. And unfortunately, the areas that we think that Joshua trees will be likely to persist in light of climate change are the same areas that have the highest abundance of these invasive grasses and are most likely to burn. So it's kind of a double whammy. If you look at this map here, the blue little outline, that's the approximate distribution of Joshua trees within the park. The green polygons are areas that we've mapped as refugia, areas that we think that Joshua trees will be able to survive at the turn of the century. And that's under a low emissions scenario. The pink areas on here are areas, that's our fire history. Those are areas that have burned. And about 20 or so % of our Joshua tree refugia have already burned. We've been collecting some data from burned areas. This picture here is from the Covington fire, which burned in 1995. This photo was taken 22 years after that. We put in a 500 by 500 meter plot here to look at Joshua tree recovery, and there's very little Joshua tree recovery in some of these burned areas. They're just not coming back. So our resource stewardship strategy tells us that we ought to be controlling these invasive grasses to minimize threats to Joshua trees from fire. And specifically, I've highlighted it here in yellow that we need to find effective control measures for invasive grasses. Now that implies that we don't know how to do this, and we don't. So we started trying things out. And this map here, this is kind of complex, and there's a lot of text on here, but we've started to implement a 3-phase strategy to protect Joshua tree climate change refugia from invasive grass-fueled wildfires. The first part of this is putting in a fuel break along Covington Flats Road. The second part of this is protecting unburned islands, the few that exist in Covington Flats, from fire by putting in fuel breaks around those. And then the third part involves protecting individual Joshua trees up around the upper Covington backcountry board, which is where some of the largest Joshua trees in existence are found. So we started implementing phase 1 of this project in March of last year, putting in a fuel break. And this picture here shows a contracting crew doing the work. And they also removed some of the perennial native vegetation out there to help limit the spread of fire, in addition to the invasive grasses. They put in a 30-foot strip along either side of the road. Now, right away, we found some challenges with this. Firstly, we started doing that work in March to try to get rid of the grass before it went to seed, to increase the longevity of the treatment. However, 2019 was a very wet year, and there was a lot of regrowth following the implementation of those treatments. And you can see that here in this photo. You can see that treatment line on the right side, but you can see all the regrowth of schismus and also a native called Amsynchia, which can also carry fire, or fiddlenecks, you may know it as that. So there's this need for repeat maintenance, and we had another contract crew go out later in the summer and redo these fuel breaks. Another challenge is that this work is done with power tools, with string trimmers and chainsaws. And most of our Joshua tree refugia are in wilderness, and how do we do this work in a wilderness setting? This is just a map showing phase 3 of this project. This is the Upper Covington Backcountry Board. The purple area is an area where we would like to treat around individual Joshua trees, remove the grasses from a 20-foot radius around each tree. And the little green dots on here are Joshua trees. There's 226 of them there. Just really high quality Joshua trees that we'd like to protect. And the idea is we don't know how long it's going to take us to do this work, but we'd start by the trailhead and work our way out. And that's why there's rings on there. Another project, this is a project along trails emanating from Black Rock. The trails are the little green lines. The pink polygons in there are high quality stands of Joshua trees where we have healthy mature Joshua trees, where we also have Joshua tree seedlings establishing, and high covers of invasive grass. And so the idea is that we would remove these grasses along these trails to protect these high quality stands of Joshua trees. Now this is all in wilderness, and the idea is that we're going to try to do this with only hand tools. And we did some experimenting with hand tools, and it seems like it's a possibility that we might be able to do this with rakes and double-edged weed trimmers. There's a few hand tools that you can use. We'd need a lot of help from large groups, volunteers, conservation corps crews, that sort of thing. The other thing, and I'm not going to touch on this very much, but the other concern with these invasive grasses is that they are very likely outcompeting our native annual plant species. And these native annuals are what make up our wildflower blooms and add to our diversity. So I'm very concerned that over time, as these grasses such as schismus spread, that we're going to have a less robust wildflower bloom. When we do get these wet years and we have what could be a super bloom, we're going to see more of these invasive grasses. So that's a big concern of them. Okay, I guess I'll pause again and see if there's any questions.
There is a question circling back to fountain grass, and also this question was asked before you explained about fire regimes and competition, but a question of why is fountain grass an exotic that needs removal? So fire regimes, possible competition, any other reasons?
Yeah. So, I think that's a really good question. That's actually something I do think a lot about. Why do we focus on fountain grass? The first thing is that fountain grass often grows in riparian areas, and these are areas where we have really high diversity, and they're very important for wildlife. So we're concerned about it outcompeting the native plants in those areas. Secondly, if fountain grass is known to change fire regimes, compared to the annual grasses, it's very minor, and the places that it's growing in the park aren't areas that are very likely to burn because they're so rocky. But the other reason is that fountain grass is a plant that we have the ability to have success at treating. there is, I don't know if we'll ever be able to fully eradicate fountain grass, but I feel like with our partnership with IPMT, we're on the cusp of that. So I have seen areas where fountain grass has totally taken over and become dominant. Like if you go into the foothills of the San Jacinto Mountains, if you like by the Palm Springs aerial tramway, you can see areas in there where on the slopes of those mountains, fountain grass is the most abundant plant.
Well, there's a related question. Is schismus the grass that is responsible for the green carpet in springtime, or is there a native plant that we could attribute that to?
More likely than not, it's going to be schismus, especially if you're like in the Morongo Basin and in most of the park. It's mainly what you're seeing is schismus. There are some natives that could be in there, but unfortunately, it's schismus.
That's all the questions we have right now.
Okay, thank you so much. So next I'm going to start talking about mustards. There's a phrase that's often used called hold the mustard when talking about hand pulling mustard. I think I don't know who coined it, but I think it's a great phrase. So hold the mustard. So in the park, we have 5 different species of invasive mustards, and I'm going to try to identifying these different species. It's pretty complex. I even get confused and scratch my head sometimes, but I'm going to try to demystify it as much as I possibly can. But the 5 species that we have are Sahara mustard. Then we have 3 species in the genus Cecimbrium, which are London rocket, Eastern rocket, and tall tumble mustard. And then lastly, we have short pod mustard, which unlike the first 4, short pod is a perennial. It's a short-lived perennial, but it is a perennial. It's not an annual. We also have native mustards in the park, and a couple of them look somewhat like the invasive mustards. However, I think it's much more likely that you're going to mis-ID one of the invasive mustards for another invasive mustard than you would for a native mustard. The best diagnostics for identifying invasive mustards are the leaves primarily, and then secondarily the fruits. And I put a picture here of the fruits because I want you all to know what mustard fruits look like. Mustards do have different types of fruits, but all the invasive mustards here have these fruits called saliques, and they're these long, slender pods that you see in that photo. Those are the fruits. And if you opened up one of those pods, they're teeny little pods, but if you opened it up, you'd see these tiny little seeds in there. So you should all know what the fruits look like now. Okay, so first is Sahara mustard. This is probably the most infamous of the invasive mustards in the desert. It's probably the most common invasive mustard that we have park-wide, although it's not the most common one that most people see. So Sahara mustard, it really is very readily distinguished with its leaves because the leaves have bumps on them. And if you look at that photo on the bottom left, you can see those bumps. I took that photo yesterday at Keysview. There's also short prickly hairs on the leaves. And when you grab one of the leaves, you can feel how rough it is from those short prickly hairs and those bumps. The fruits point up and away. When Sahara mustards get big, all the stems coming off of them grow all together. They get really tangled. To me, it looks kind of like a Tasmanian dust devil or a hurricane or something. That's a good diagnostic for Sahara mustard as well. But sometimes they're not that big, especially when it's drier. Sahara mustard, when it's just only in leaf and it hasn't bolted, the leaves can be confused for chia, which is a native species. But when chia flowers, it looks very different. It has purple flowers. The smell also is very different. If you smell the leaves, chia is going to have this very sagey kind of smell, and the mustards have a very distinct smell too. Yeah, so Sahara mustard can get really huge, like the photo on the left, but in dry years or in places where, it aren't as good for growth, it can be really small too, but it's always going to have those bumps on the leaves and those hairs on the leaves. Depending on your location, you may be more likely to see it. Sahara mustard tends to be more abundant at the lower elevations primarily, but not exclusively. Southern boundary is a great place to see Sahara mustard. Pinto Basin, the worst Sahara mustard infestation we have in the park, I think, is Clark's Pass off of Highway 62 out on the eastern side of the park towards the Coxcombs. That infestation has really grown in size. It's spreading off the highway. Another thing I've noticed in my meanderings in the park is that Sahara mustard for some reason grows on tops of ridges. And you'll see it a lot on the crest of the little San Bernardinos. So I was just at Keys View yesterday, and there is Sahara mustard along the sidewalk there. It's at the end of the Covington Crest Trail. We have an infestation there, and I don't know if it has to do with wind patterns and seeds getting deposited on the tops of ridges, but you find it there. And also along Utah Trail, just south of the north entrance, going up to the junction there by Pinto Y, there's some quite a bit along the roadside there as well. Our next mustard is London Rocket. Now this is one of the sesymbriums. There's 3 sesymbriums that we have in the park. London Rocket, its leaves don't have hairs on them. And they don't have bumps on them like Sahara mustard. That is probably the best diagnostic for London Rocket. Hairless leaves. The lobes on the leaves tend to be kind of more triangular. Sometimes it reminds me of the typical jack-o'-lantern smile, the leaves. The fruits are also kind of diagnostic. There tends to be more fruits on it. They're denser on the stem. And to distinguish it from the other sesymbriums, the pedicel, which is the stalk of the fruit, the little stem that holds the fruit, the pedicel is not as wide as the fruit itself. It's narrower than the fruit. Just some more pictures of London Rocket leaves. You can see that they don't have any hairs on them. We've got some pretty big infestations of London Rocket in the park. This picture I took yesterday in Pleasant Valley. It's all over the dry lake bed. It probably is a few square miles of thick London Rocket out there. Other locations, the Oasis of Mara. We did quite a bit of work last year. We had to hold the mustard event at headquarters, and we pulled a lot of London Rocket from headquarters and also from the Oasis, and it was looking really good up into March, but with the late rain that we had, it's really taken over in the Oasis this year. It's looking pretty bad there. One thing is that London Rocket is not that common in the topside area. It is there, but the other species of sesymbrium are much more common at the higher elevations, in the climbing areas along topside, along Park Boulevard. Which brings me to the next species of mustard. This is tall tumble mustard. This one is the most common mustard in the topside area. The pedicels, the stalks that hold the fruits, are about the same thickness as the fruits. They're not narrower like London Rocket. To me, this one also has more of a tree-like growth form generally, and the leaves have many more segments. Here's some pictures of the leaves. There's just lots and lots of segments. You can see the variability in the leaves there. When the plants are not getting as much water or growing under less favorable conditions, the leaf segments will be narrower. There's also stiff hairs on the leaves. Here's another patch of tall tumble mustard. It's called that because when it dries out, it breaks off and tumbles, just like a tumbleweed. It spreads that way. It's the seed spread. It's very, very abundant in topside. Quail Springs picnic area, in the old burn scars there, it's very, very common. Juniper Flats, Queen Valley, and there's some in Lower Covington Flats as well. I took this picture yesterday. This is what tumble mustard is looking like in Queen Valley. It is a sea of yellow right now. Another mustard, the third of the Cecimbriums, is Eastern Rocket, or Cecimbrium orientale. This one, it doesn't have as many fruits, and it doesn't have as many stems coming up. That's one good way to diagnose it. But the leaves are also very distinctive. And here's a picture of some of the leaves of Eastern Rocket. There's less leaf segments overall, and that terminal leaf segment, the one that points straight out at the end, that one tends to be elongated. Val Cancino says that these leaves look like a chicken foot. And I guess I see that, although I don't look at chicken feet very often. But yeah, pretty distinctive leaves. They're also hairy. Eastern Rocket, for a long time we've said, oh, Eastern Rocket, we find it growing primarily at parking lots. So we've got in the upper right, we've got Ryan Mountain Trailhead. It's all over there by the latrine. And then there's Hall of Horrors growing all along the fence there. It's starting to spread towards the rock formations now. However, Eastern Rocket seems to have started to spread more rapidly, and that's a common thing with invasive plants. You'll see something kind of just be hanging out for a while, then all of a sudden it'll just take off and start growing like crazy. And in my drive through the park yesterday, trying to learn about the kind of the status of these infestations, I saw a lot of Eastern Rocket along Pinto Basin Road near Porcupine Wash, going all the way down to Cottonwood, growing along the road. And we've seen it there a little bit before, but not like it is this year, unfortunately. So this is very concerning. The last mustard that we have is short pod mustard. Now this one is different than the others because it's a perennial, and we only have it growing in the park in one location, and that's at Black Rock Horse Camp. And we've been actively treating this infestation with herbicide. We are now down to about 50 plants that are coming up, and I think hopefully this year or by next year, we will have eradicated short pod mustard from the park. However, in the region as a whole, it is spreading and taking over. It's really abundant at Pioneer Town in that area, and up on Yucca Mesa by the Landers landfill. There's some up there. It's spreading. I think yesterday when I was driving back home, I think I saw it growing in the Starbucks parking lot in 29 Palms. So and it was maybe spread that way because of imported material that they put in. So one to be on the lookout for. So, one technique to control mustard is to have a volunteer day and pull the mustard. Pull the mustard, put it in a bag, throw it in the landfill. And you can get a lot of work done with a large volunteer group. On Earth Day in 2017, we pulled almost 30,000 tumble mustard plants from the Juniper Flats trailhead area. It was several trips to the landfill with a trailer of bags of mustard that we removed, but it kind of felt like taking one bite out of the apple. So it's really challenging. What do we do to stop this? And so this is kind of the mantra. While we figure out ways to treat widespread infestations, we need to keep invasive plants out of the areas they are just beginning to colonize. And this photo here this is a lone Sahara mustard plant in a wash south of Black Eagle Mine Road. So we need to keep the areas that don't have infestations free of infestations. That is our #1 priority. So that brings me to chapter 5, the invasive plant patrol. So the Invasive Plant Patrol is a group of trained volunteers and park staff from all divisions that map and report on satellite infestations. So by that, those are isolated infestations kind of on the edge of the main infestation where invasive plants are spreading. Now these trained volunteers and staff that are trained in identification, they also treat satellite infestations as they are encountered by cutting. For annual plants, they cut them at the base, below the basal rosette of leaves, the lowest leaves. For perennials, such as fountain grass, they cut off the reproductive parts. So here's an example. This is in Rock House Canyon, a very remote part of the park. There's a lone fountain grass plant growing here. I happened to just be hiking here, and so I had my shears, and I clipped off all the fertile portions, and I put them in my bread bag that had previously been holding my lunch, and I packed them out. I took a photo of it, and I posted it on iNaturalist. And we have an iNaturalist project for the members of the Invasive Plant Patrol. And wow, we've documented a lot of infestations. Almost 400 observations of almost 30 species. We've got 61 members of the Invasive Plant Patrol, which is awesome. So I'm just going to hold questions to the end. I'm getting a little short on time here. So back in 2018, we had a workshop here at the park called Working Together Against Weeds. Probably some of you were involved in that. And there's things that you can do to help. Basically, there's two categories. You can implement best management practices to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive plants. And you can also help us do early detection rapid response, which is what the Invasive Plant Patrol is all about. Finding those satellite infestations and responding to them rapidly. So people spread invasive plants around. And both visitors and park staff do it. We get seeds that get stuck to our clothing. We get seeds that get stuck to vehicles, our shoes. If you walk through a cheatgrass or red brome infestation, you are going to get tons of seeds in your socks and in your shoes, and it's going to be really annoying. We need to get rid of those seeds. We need to not spread those seeds around. So any type of soil that is on your vehicle or on your tools can carry seeds of invasive plants, which can be tiny, tiny little seeds. So we need to wash those regularly, especially when we're moving from one place to another place. Another thing that we do is when we bring imported material into the park, we need to make sure that it's weed free. I've partnered with Alex and the roads crew. And anytime we bring in fill or gravel or any type of material into the park that comes from a quarry, we go and we do a quarry inspection. And this photo here shows a quarry. They have tamarisk growing in that pile of material and also along that conveyor belt. And we've been able to ask quarries to remove invasive plants from their quarry and mine fresh material for us. And they're very willing to do that. So we can be pretty confident, but not 100% confident that the material that we bring to the park is free of weed seed. So anytime if you have a project and you're bringing material into the park, please coordinate with me so that we can make sure it's coming from a source that doesn't have invasive plant seed. The other thing you can do is you can be on the lookout for invasive plants when you're out in the park. I encourage all of you to get iNaturalist on your phone and take pictures of plants that you see and post them on there. Or you can just send me photos. And this is one plant. I'm going to end with photos of this plant. I really, really want everyone here to be aware of this plant, which is called stinknet. It's really easy to recognize. It has these yellow spherical flower heads, those yellow balls at the end of on the flowers. Those, if you see any plant that has that, please take a picture of it and send it to me. Stinknet, the picture on the right is that's near Hemet. And that is all that yellow that you see is stinknet that's taken over. In the Inland Empire proper, in the western part of the Inland Empire, the non-desert part, stinknet has become really abundant in the past few years, and it's starting to spread into the desert. This map here is from iNaturalist. This is showing the distribution of stinknet. All those little red squares are places where stinknet has been observed. You can see how abundant it is in Riverside County, in western Riverside County. But we've started to see it in Desert Hot Springs, and then in Morongo Valley, and then there was an observation of it in Landers. And just this month, there was an observation on iNaturalist of stinknet taken in the Pinto Mountains. You can see that on the far right there. Now, this was on BLM land, not in the park, but it was along Brooklyn Mine Road in the Pinto Mountains. And I had kind of thought, well, maybe stinknet can't grow in the really, really dry desert, but apparently it can, and it could take over quite readily. So we really need to be on the lookout for this plant. And iNaturalist is a way to do that. So that infestation, that small infestation of stinknet on Brooklyn Mine Road, has now been removed. A couple more photos of stinknet. I want you all to just burn those images into your brain, and if you see that, please take a photo and send it to me, or put it on iNaturalist. So just a few reminders, you can really help with, invasive plants are really challenging. It's overwhelming to think of the mustard infestations and the grass infestations that we have. But it's not as overwhelming as thinking about climate change, which we really can't do anything about as managers to prevent. But we can prevent the spread of invasive plants. So make sure to clean your tools, your vehicles, your shoes, your clothing, so that it's free of seed. If you're bringing in material into the park, please coordinate with me to make sure that it's weed free. If you see invasive plants, please report them, and you can use iNaturalist to do that. Or you can just send me photos in a location. That is totally acceptable as well. And yeah, I think that's all I have. I'll take some more questions.
We have a question relevant to your final point there. So if we see these weeds in the park, can we pull them out?
No. So if you are a member of the Invasive Plant Patrol, and if you are, you know that you are, you've been, you have an iNaturalist ID, and you've gone to the training. And so if you're a member of the Invasive Plant Patrol, you can treat satellite infestations by cutting, by clipping. And the reason why we don't pull is because when we pull out an invasive plant out of the ground, that can create ground disturbance, and there can be subsurface resources like archaeological resources that can be disturbed by doing that. And so that's why we only hand pull invasive plants in areas that have been cleared by the Cultural Resources Branch and given us the okay to do so. So if you're not a member of the Invasive Plant Patrol, you can help by documenting them. And if you are a member of the Invasive Plant Patrol, you can help by clipping.
And of course, the next question is, when will there be training for Invasive Plant Patrol, and how do we get in?
Yeah, so we had 2 trainings earlier this year, and we'll do another training. Probably the next one will be next winter. I was considering, well, could this training, could this webinar be a training for the Invasive Plant Patrol? And I'm not quite comfortable with it. I think we need to have an in-person training and some field time to help with ID. So for now, you can, if you're not already a part of it, and a lot of you are, we have 61 members. So if you aren't already a part of it, you can help by just taking the photos and sharing them with me.
Cool. So everybody has a part to play because we all have cameras on us all the time.
Yes. Okay, are there any other questions?
I am seeing folks thanking you and not any other questions.
Okay, great. Well, it's 11 o'clock. Perfect timing. Well, thank you so much for listening to me and for doing your part to help not spread invasive plants.
Neil, thank you for being here today, and thank you to our audiences. Our next webinar will be today at 1 p.m. with Kurt Leusner on amazing desert insects. Till then, please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.